All right, the recording has started. All right, welcome everyone. This is the Golden Gate Computer Society monthly general meeting where we usually have a guest speaker, and we'll get to that in a minute. I am Marcelino Nogueiro, the current president. Welcome. We're doing all these meetings now using Zoom, and as some of you know, we used to get together at the meeting room over there in Larkspur, and not in Greenbrae, actually, more recently. We're using Zoom. It's been working great for these, and the presenters are able to do a very nice job, presenting their presentations. Okay. In any case, couple of things. We're going to want everybody muted while the presentation is going on. And if you do have a question, you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand. There's a little raise hand button. And so we can keep an eye on that. And then the presenter will be looking at the chat as well as Russ and myself. So as we see questions coming up, we'll try to answer those. And then we will have a Q&A session at the end. At this point, I'll turn it over to Russ to introduce our guest speaker. Take it, Russ.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Doug Kaye, which I don't think to many of you needs any introduction, but I've had the pleasure of knowing Doug for a long time. Went on a trip with him to Cuba and had a great time doing street photography and everything. I've gone on several trips with him to San Francisco and all. Doug is a very, very good photographer. He is currently the president of the Marin Photography Club, and I'll turn it over to Doug.
Co-president. My co-other is here with me. Hello, Steve Z. Yes, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here in front of the Golden Gate Computer Society once again. What I did for tonight was, this is a presentation I've given to a couple of other photo clubs, the Contra Costa Club, I think it was, and one of the Sierra clubs, who's not an N4C club. And I'm not used to giving presentations about myself. Believe it or not, those who know me will be surprised that I'm actually very uncomfortable talking about myself. So what I did in this case is I pre-recorded this. Because there are also, I figured if I showed you enough pictures, you won't look at any one of them long enough to realize they're not that good. So you're going to see almost 300 slides in a span of about 45 minutes. Thanks to Marcelino and Steve D for helping me figure out how to play a video properly on Zoom. Marcelino, if when I start the video it doesn't work well, would you please interrupt, let me know, or tell me something in chat so I'll know it's not coming across well, okay? Thank you. With that, also, I will be monitoring chat. So if you guys know where chat is, it's at the bottom of this window. You can click on chat, you can open that window. I'll be looking at chat constantly. If you ask me a question, I may stop the video and answer it, or I may save it till the end. If you raise your hand, I won't know that probably, and so I will definitely get you at the end. All right. So with that, let me see if I can share my screen. Wish me luck here.
Yeah, be sure to check out the box.
I stopped that. I got to go back and do it again. Thank you. Check the two magic boxes.
Yep.
Both magic boxes. Okay. And you should see my entry slide, right?
Yes, we see you.
Okay. I guess we're ready to go. Here we go. Hope the audio comes through. So first, a little bit of my background. This is a somewhat embarrassing picture of me taken in Central Park, 1972 with the 8x10 full-frame film camera. Like so many of you, I started in my father's wet darkroom learning black and white photography, printing, and developing film. I went to Cal Berkeley, started in engineering physics, but ended up graduating in drama. That's a whole nother story. And I emphasized theatrical lighting design and directing. The lighting design turned out to be quite helpful in my photographic work. I've got to pause this for a second because I have to find the chat window. For some reason, it's disappeared on me.
It should be at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, but when you're sharing your screen, it disappears. I cannot see the chat window, so I'm just going to let this run.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on the chat and I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks. In theater and film in the Bay Area for a few years, and then I decided to go back to school to study cinematography. So I moved to New York with my wife, and I went to NYU, learned cinematography, and after leaving NYU, I worked for a few years in television news and produced some documentaries. But for 30 years, I was in the software business after that and did virtually no photography, except for maybe the family photographs of my wife and my son. That was it. That's all I did. No serious photography. So what am I doing now? Or should we say, what was I doing now? I was leading workshops of street photography in Cuba and in San Francisco. I was teaching photography. I was teaching Photoshop. I was teaching Lightroom. I still do some of that online as well. I am currently the co-president of the Marin Photography Club and the co-leader of the Street Photography Special Interest Group. And on occasion, I still am the co-host and producer of the Camera Labs Photography Podcast, where Gordon Lang and I review cameras, lenses, and so forth. And here's a picture of me in the podcast studio, although I don't have quite so much equipment anymore, but that's what it was. So in 2009, my wife and I decided to take a trip to Kenya. And I said, well, I guess I better get a camera if I'm going to be spending 3 weeks driving around looking at animals. Called up a friend. I said, what should I get? And he said, get a Nikon D90. So that was my first real digital camera. That was back in 2009. But after Kenya, I decided I really needed to get back into photography. I enjoyed it so much. So I'm just going to go through and show you lots and lots of photographs. I have over 200 of them. You know, a portfolio probably shouldn't have more than 40 or 50 images. So I'm showing you things that may not be portfolio quality, but I think it helps tell my story. One of the things I teach is that photographs need to stand on their own. I'm not going to be showing you any titles or captions. I'll tell you a few stories, but not too many. For example, here in this image, I'm out in the wet. Well, you can get from the image that it's raining and that I'm wet and that I'm probably cold. It comes across in the photograph. I don't have to tell you that. And I think that's very important. I think it's important that what you see in the frame tells the entire story. You don't get to experience the smells, the sounds, the temperature, the humidity, nothing outside the frame. Having said that, I am going to tell a lot of behind-the-scenes stories. I wouldn't do this for an exhibition, but for the sake of training and education, it's probably worth talking about that. One time I went out to the Golden Gate Bridge 40 times in 30 days trying to get the fog just right. Never quite got it, but I got a couple of nice pictures anyway. Here's an old friend in Inverness that everyone has photographed, and now it's pretty much falling apart. But I photographed lots of things, including car details, sculpture at the Hyatt Regency in San Francisco, the Painted Ladies in San Francisco, the construction of the new bridge before the old one was torn down, Civic Center. This is a fun one. This is one of my early HDR pictures. If you can see the original, you'd notice that the sky is very bright and that the boat is completely dark. And it took HDR to bring it out. Notice that the boat is as bright as the sun, which is hardly realistic. I did a number of experiments with light painting. Here's the Bliss Dance sculpture before it was removed from Treasure Island. Here's an experiment I did early on with selective color, something they tell you should never do, but I had fun with it. I dabbled in nature a little bit and ended up with a couple of decent photographs, even after coming home from Kenya. I played with macro for a little bit. That was fun. Aviation is something I took fairly seriously. I've shot the Blue Angels and some other air shows for many years. Really enjoy it. It's a great challenge. I love getting out there. The lenses are a little heavy. My wrists are getting a little old and tired, but I really enjoy shooting aviation. And of course, like everyone else in the club, I had to get into travel photography. My wife and I have made a lot of interesting trips in the last 10 years, including a trip to Holland. And we have a bizarre reputation. We were in Cairo on January 25th, 2011, the day the revolution broke out in Egypt. And then later we were in Istanbul when the protests happened there. So our general rule is if you want to know what's going on in parts of the world, just follow us. We'll be there. In 2012, I said, all right, I'll get into landscape photography. So I signed up for some workshops with Michael Fry and Jeff Sullivan, made trips to Death Valley, to the Eastern Sierra, to the northwest corner of California, where I shot in the redwoods. Really enjoyed it. Okay, but the big change was going to Cuba. So in 2013, I decided to take a photo workshop in Cuba. And of course, I fell in love with the country, the people, the cigars, the rum, the whole thing. And I started taking quite a few pictures there and really enjoyed it. I began with architecture and cars like everybody else did. But I quickly learned that photographing people was what it's all about. And in Cuba, it really is all about the people, and people actually enjoy being photographed there. Quite different than what you get in this part of the world. And so I did a lot of photography in Cuba over many years. I've made 8 trips there, including leading 7 workshops of my own. And as you can see, a lot of these are actually portraits where I got permission from people to photograph them and did some nice close-up portraits. Here's one of my friend Helen. She's a tobacco farmer in Vinales, Cuba. I've seen her many times. And in fact, in this shack, there's a print of this picture hanging on the wall now, and she just loves it. This was my New Year's card, my Christmas and New Year's card a couple of years ago. And of course, the Cuban kids are just marvelous. They're fascinating. They're so sociable. I spent a lot of time with ballerinas. On the workshops, we hire ballerinas as models. These 2 young women are from the National Ballet of Cuba, and I've worked with both of them multiple times. Here's the List Alfonso Dance Company. Those of you who have been with me to Cuba remember this picture, as well as some of the other places that we've been. This is also part of my introduction to dance photography. You can see I was quite enamored with it. In 2014, I decided to take another workshop. This was my first street workshop. I decided to take a workshop with Jay Maisel. I knew that he was going to be retiring, and it was one of the last chances to get in there. This is my favorite picture from that because this is Jay and I in Katz's Deli. This is a picture of me trying to explain something to Jay Maisel. If you can think how incredibly arrogant that is, that's what I'm trying to do here. If you have a chance, there's a great documentary out there called Jay Myself, and I hope you get a chance to see it. In 2014, I decided I really had to get landscape out of my system. I had to just go do landscape photography, and I said, what better place than to go to Iceland? So with a bunch of landscape photographers, there were about 10 of us, and we all went to Iceland, and we walked around, and we went through ice and steam and rain and lots of hiking and carrying gear through the cold and the wet. It was interesting, to say the least. You can see here I am taking pictures of ice and more ice and snow, more ice. But this photograph was a very important turning point. We went to this great bay where the icebergs are just floating around. And there were 10 of us, and we sort of spread out, all trying to get our individual pictures. But you notice that most of my images so far from Iceland have no people. So all 10 of us are standing around at this bay that has all these icebergs. Beautiful place. And in comes on this canoe, kayak, whatever it is, a guy in a red jacket. Well, all of the other photographers, the landscape photographers, are yelling, "Get out of the shot, move, keep going, move." For me, this is the perfect shot. For me, this is the classic guy in the red jacket in the middle of my landscape photography. And I realized that having people in my shots is what made it much, much more interesting. So here's something that you'll find interesting. When I teach street photography groups, one of the things I do is I go out and I show this list of what's the essential gear for landscape photography. Here's what a guy named Jeb Buckman put out as a list for what you need. First of all, you need good internet access. You need a strong backpack. You need to have a weather-sealed camera, a sturdy tripod, the right collection of lenses, remote trigger or shutter release for your camera. You need a set of filters, extra batteries, extra media cards. You need to use the photographer's ephemeris so you can figure out where the sun's going up, where it's going down, where the moon's going up, where the moon's going down. You need a good pair of shoes. My point in showing this is that you need almost none of this for street photography. In fact, when the weather gets a little bit iffy, street photographers stop for a latte. And as you can imagine, by the time you put that all together and you go to a place like Iceland, you get this. My quote from this is, "I have never been so wet in my entire life." as the week I spent in Iceland. But after going out and cruising around and looking at all the great scenery in Iceland, which is spectacular, if you're a landscape photographer, you really need to go there. So after all that, we got back to Reykjavik, and I was really more in my element there. And I started doing more street photography. And you can imagine that the 9 other photographers, all of who were landscape photographers, said, "What on earth are you doing? Why are you doing that?" Or they would see me taking pictures of people across the street. They said, "Well, you can't just take pictures of people." Well, by the end of our time in Reykjavik, they were actually working as my spotters and saying, "Look, Doug, there's another Viking." And of course, there were Vikings all over. I got to tell you a great story about this woman. I was in Paris during Fashion Week one year, met one of the models who said she was from Iceland. And I said, "Oh, well, I was in Iceland and I took pictures of lots of people." Well, there are only 300 and some thousand people in all of Iceland, and 180,000 of them live in Reykjavik. So I showed her this picture on my phone, and she says, "Oh yeah, that's Ilsa," or whatever her name was. Turns out that this woman in this shot is also a model, and that all the models, of course, in Reykjavik knew one another. It was just hilarious that she knew her. Here's a woman who worked at the local VW dealership, who I followed down the street into a pizzeria until I could get permission to take her photograph. Here's a woman that I noticed in one of the buildings, and I started from, about 100 yards away and moved closer and closer, and finally got close enough that I asked her to take this picture. I just thought the light and the colors were great. Of course, Reykjavik even has hipsters, so I got my hipster picture. And people who dress all sorts of strange ways, for sure. But this is where I started to get involved in really understanding what street photography was all about. Some of you have heard me say an interesting subject does not make an interesting photograph. You need to tell stories. You need to have something going on. This is an example of that. Here you've got a guy looking at a woman. Well, the woman's one thing, but the guy looking at her is what makes the picture work. Here's a couple having, let's say, a discussion of some sort. Oh, look, here's another Reykjavik couple having a discussion. Notice that she's a little shorter than he is. Okay, so in 2016, I was invited by Steve Dissenhoff to start shooting some dance photography. Well, I really fell in love with that. I think at this point, I love dance photography almost as much as I love street photography. It's just a marvelous thing to do. Nothing that you'll see here was staged. Everything is a live performance or a rehearsal. And I'm going to go through these very quickly so you can just get an idea of some of the stuff I've done in dance photography. But I really do enjoy it. It's really marvelous. And there's no end to what these talented dancers can do. And this is one of my favorites, a young dancer at Dominican College. Again, nothing staged here, but she just ended up being such a marvelous subject for photography. I just couldn't stop taking pictures of her. I photographed at Dominican College and with Steve also some of the Lions Ballet training program and a number of other dance companies in San Francisco. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to do some fashion photography. What you're going to see here are some runway shots, except for a couple that were posed. You should be able to see that. This is a runway shot, another runway shot, a posed shot. This one, believe it or not, is also a runway shot. This was just, I'm sitting on the floor looking up to grab this one. A posed shot, obviously, and so forth. One great way to get started in street photography is to do events. The nice thing about event photography is that people want to be photographed. They are wearing costumes, they're dressed up, they're proud of what they've got, and it's really a great way to get started in street photography where you don't have to deal with the problem of, can I get permission to take the picture? So here are some shots from Carnival, for example. I got involved with another project doing a series of pictures for the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in San Francisco. This is one of my first. It's hanging in my living room, and I tell people that one of the most beautiful women I've ever photographed is actually a guy. And a couple of the other sisters who have posed for me. Really fun. A couple of years ago, we created the Street Photography Special Interest Group. And once we got going, we began to roll out a series of monthly challenges. Here's a look at the web page where we list some of those challenges. So in this next section of my presentation, my plan is to show you my work in the context of how I addressed each of these challenges, or how I brought some examples to the challenges. So the first one we did was called All on the Camera, Wide Angle. The idea was to do no cropping, do nothing in post-production. Whatever you shoot, that's what you have to show. And that was fairly successful. Challenge number 2 was street still life. We divided street photography into sort of 3 groups: still life, candids, and portraits. And still life means there are no people in the shot, so their architecture and so forth. So here are some examples of my street still life work over the last couple of years. The next category of street photography we call street candids, and that's where you take pictures of people, but you have neither implicit or explicit permission to photograph them. They might be near, they might be far, but the idea is that you don't have permission, you're just taking a candid picture. And in many cases, it's not so much a picture of the person, the picture is just a part of the composition. They're a prop, if you will. Sometimes it's really nice to combine the smoothness of a human form with the angular architecture of something in the street and so forth. Sometimes there's a lot of humor in candid street photography. Here's an example of that. This is one image that I shot on film. I'm doing quite a bit of film photography these days. Another example of a bit of humor. This is a phone booth in Cienfuegos, Cuba. I was told this is a very difficult picture to get. This is a butcher in a market in Havana, and apparently he hates being photographed and yells at everybody who tries to take his picture. But I think I caught him when he wasn't paying attention. And this is the old SF MoMA before the remodel. Good story here was, I got out there, I was just looking at this balcony, and I said, boy, I sure wish somebody would be in that frame. And this woman just walked out and looked up, and I just caught it just at the right moment. And one thing you learned about shooting street photography is that if you see a person with a dog, you can always get their picture. You start by complimenting them on the dog, you take a picture of the dog, and then you work your way up to take a picture of the person with the dog. It always works. People love their dogs just like they love their tattoos. And here are a few more examples of street portraits. This one I love. This is Central Park. I just love the relationship of the woman to her drawing. This is how we dressed in the 21st century. Guy reading his book in North Beach. Having a drink at Tadich Grill. A woman in a makeup class. A guy smoking in Chinatown. A guy with bright white shoes in front of a poster. A woman considering the mannequins. Tourists waiting for a taxi in Sausalito. The classic New York subway station look. Grand Central Station. A homeless man in San Francisco. A mysterious person in his car in Havana, Cuba. An animated dialogue in Cuba. A woman at a playground in Cuba. A woman in front of Che Guevara in Cuba. 3 guys eating lunch in San Francisco. A woman in Venice. A family, I assume, in Barcelona. Another woman in Barcelona. Your typical San Francisco street scene. And of course, a model on Broadway in New York City. And a man hanging from a star in Normandy, France. And the third and final category of the way in which we've divided street photography is street portraits. And that's where you do have either implicit or explicit permission to take someone's photograph. Implicit could just be that they look at you and acknowledge you're there. Explicit, of course, is where they say, of course you can take my picture. Here's an example of a cute little girl that I wanted to photograph, and her mother and grandmother gave me permission to do that while she was eating lunch. Great story behind this one. This was a model at a fashion shoot near Times Square in New York, and although she was actually working for some other photographers, I just happened to be there with my camera, and she posed for me in addition to posing for her crew. This was a woman on the Embarcadero in San Francisco. We hardly interacted at all. This guy and his wife were from Detroit. She got cropped out of the picture, but she also had glasses with reflections of the Eiffel Tower. This is Leo in Havana. And a souvenir salesman in Istanbul. A fun story about this one. This is Washington Square Park in New York. I was on the other side of the fountain, and I saw this woman with this great hair. It was a hot, hot day, and she just got her hair wet and shook her head, and all the water went flying off. So I went over to her, and I told her, I showed her the picture that I'd taken from far away on the back of the camera, and I said, "Would you mind doing that again?" And she did, and it just turned out to be a great picture. She was a marvelous subject. This is another guy named Leo. This one's at Coney Island. A dapper San Franciscan. A French painter in his studio. This one was really fun. I got the idea from another photographer. I went to France and took some red non-prescription glasses with me. And I went up to people, some of whom didn't speak any English, and my French is useless. And I just showed them that I wanted them to wear the glasses. And I took the picture, and sometimes there was literally no discussion, but ended up with a lot of really fun pictures of people wearing my red glasses. One good technique for getting started in street photography, in fact, it's good for advanced street photographers as well, is to look for stages. A stage is essentially a background. So you find a location with an interesting background, you set up your shot, maybe even pre-focus your camera, but you're waiting for your subject to enter the scene. In fact, you don't even know who the subject is. You're just waiting for an interesting person or an appropriate person to enter the scene to potentially interact with your background, your stage, or potentially to have some juxtaposition with the background. So here are an example of some stages that you might find helpful. This one is at SF MoMA. It's in an old Yoko Ono exhibit. That's Yoko Ono's eye up there. Here's one in Coral Gables, Florida that I caught from the top of a tourist bus. Here's a stage from Hong Kong. Some of you may recognize that location. This is an antique bookstore in Venice, Italy, with all sorts of waterlogged books that have hardened to the point that they're like bricks. I waited for someone to walk through in the doorway in the alley behind. This is a type of juxtaposition. It's a poster with a man walking in front of it. This one's from Reykjavik. I just love the colors and the relationship of his bag to the wall. Here's a classic from Cuba. I'm sorry to say that I've gone back to this location many times, and somebody has repainted that wall a very faded, dull yellow, so you can't get that shot anymore. Here's one from Chinatown in Oakland. Our next challenge is isolating your subject using light and shadow. The idea is literally to set the subject off from the foreground, the background, and so forth, but using light and shadow to do it. In fact, in this shot, the background is just a poster. You can't tell that perhaps, but that's just a poster and a woman walking in front of it. The next challenge is layers, and that's to try and develop a composition that has foregrounds, backgrounds, maybe a midground, and so you get layers and depth in your image. Here's a shot of a couple of guys in Cuba one night. They've got good layers, I think. And here's one of my favorites. This image I particularly like because I put it into competition to really upset the judges. The idea was I've got cut off legs, I've got a little piece of a car, I've got part of a woman, but I love the look of her zigzag stripes and the crosswalk stripes. But again, the judges say, oh my God, you've got stuff sticking out of the edges of the frames. Our next challenge was motion. There are a few different ways to shoot motion. Here's an example of your subject's in the foreground, the camera is still, but your background is moving. Here's another example where your subject's in the background, the camera is still, but the foreground is moving. And here's the more classic panning shot where you pan to keep your subject relatively sharp and let the background blur because of the movement of the camera. Same thing for this one. As you can tell, I'm attracted to zigzags and stripes. Here's an interesting thing to know about blurring images, and that's when people walk, there's a point at which their feet are on the ground and they're not moving. So if you get a blurry image of somebody walking, if you time it right, you can get the foot sharp, but the rest of the body in motion. Our next challenge was black and white or color. Which one works better? I'm not going to show you all the examples, but here was one that I particularly like because this picture only makes sense in color, and that is the similarity of her hair to the firebox. Black and white, this just wouldn't work. And here are two shots in a row, same location, different days, different people, one in black and white and the other in color. Another great challenge to do is to go out and try and find reflections. Lots of ways to do that, lots of ways to interpret the reflections and so forth. So here are some examples. People across the street in a storefront window, a guy in the ferry building looking particularly pensive, an inverted reflection on the streets of San Francisco, and a woman alone looking out the window of a train in France. Another challenge we took on was to shoot couples. Could be anything, as long as it's two. Here are two women. This is in Washington Square Park in New York. I went up to them. I said, I want to take your picture. And they said, why? And I said, because you guys look so terrific. And the woman on the right says, no one said that to me for 40 years. Here are some shots of couples taken on Coney Island. They may not look friendly, but they really were. Couples come in all sizes and ages. Based on the work with Jay Maisel, we came up with the challenge of light, color, and gesture, and trying to work those three elements in photographs. Here's one that's pure gesture. This is a couple in a market in Havana, and she was very animated and had no idea she was being photographed, but she was quite involved. Here's one that emphasizes color. I saw the red coat, the red paint on the street. I told her I needed to get that picture. She says, I don't want to be photographed. I says, don't worry, I'm not taking your picture. I just want your coat. So she agreed. Shoot up, shoot down. That's always a good idea. Don't just look ahead of yourself. Of course, look behind yourself, but look up, look down. Sometimes the angle makes a big difference. Here are some construction workers south of Market in San Francisco. And just sort of a semi-abstract with legs at SF MoMA. Looking down. I photographed these two people in San Francisco, but I thought the lower halves of their bodies were by far the most interesting, so this is also a looking down shot. One of my favorite challenges is to find juxtapositions, and that's where your primary subject is juxtaposed with a background with which they may or may not have any contact. This one is simply happy. And this is a shot on the Larkspur Ferry. Here's a woman buying clothes in Maui. Sometimes you get a shot like this, and the people walking by don't realize what it is that you're seeing because they're coming from the other direction. So you can get a lot of fun things to happen this way. Another example, I don't think she had a clue of the relationship of her hair to that sign. And after doing this for a year and a half or so, we decided to go out and do street photography projects, where each of us defined a project and we went out and met the needs for that. My project was called Into the Light, and I gathered together a number of my photographs that I thought expressed the idea of shooting into the light, more or less, instead of shooting with the light behind you or to the side. The ferry building in San Francisco. SF MoMA. This one's called A Pole, a Person, and a Pigeon. This is a railway station in Paris. I love the light here. I went back half a year later to try and get the shot again. And of course, the light was completely different at that time of year, and I was totally unsuccessful. And here's a street side cafe in Paris, which I just love. If you look at this, you'll see light coming from all different directions. There's light coming from the back. There's light bouncing off from one side, light bouncing off from the other. Really love it. This one is a night shot in Vinales, Cuba. Then we picked a challenge called This Doesn't Belong. I guess that's sort of one of these things is not like the other. And so we find things that just don't quite fit. This is a bit of a mysterious photograph, wouldn't you say? What do you think it is? Well, it turns out that the woman is actually on a large poster. And this man is simply walking in front of that poster. This next shot is one that is one of my favorite stories of all. You saw this woman earlier in the presentation. So the story behind this is that I was walking around Times Square, and I saw this very tall ladder with a photographer with a 600 millimeter lens on it. At least that's what it looked like. And he was aiming down into the intersection. So I followed that line, and sure enough, there was this woman, and she was just sort of wandering around the crowd. She had a jacket over her shoulder, but she was dressed like this. And typically in New York style, most people were simply ignoring her. Won't pay any attention to this woman who looked like this walking around Times Square. So I had a camera, and for some reason, she decided to start posing for me, and she moved around and posed in different positions. But I particularly like this shot because of the woman behind her with the I Love New York bag. So this one I've titled I Love New York. So this challenge was to go out and shoot things at night and or with wet streets or wet somehow. This is marvelous. Our cameras are now so good that shooting at night is no problem at all. Here's one just taken with some of the steam vents in San Francisco, which I love. And here's one with what looks like smoke or fog. It's actually the smoke from the New Year's firecrackers at a Chinese New Year. Another great challenge, 1 location, 1 hour. The idea here is to go to a spot, like an intersection, and stay there for 1 hour and try and shoot all the things that occur there in that hour. And one of the things you find when you do that is you become part of the environment. And people after a while will pretty much ignore you, making it easier and easier to shoot this shot. Here's one. I stood at the top of an escalator and ambushed people as they came off the escalator. They had no choice but to be photographed. This guy didn't look particularly happy about it. And I think if his girlfriend hadn't been there, it could have been very difficult for me, let's say. Here's a shot in Hong Kong. So this shot is a classic for me, and it requires a little explanation. I was in the Saint Sulpice Church in Paris, and went in. The light in this church is just gorgeous all over the place. But I saw the light coming in the door, and I just stood at the door with my camera and waited. Well, at one point, this young girl walks in with her grandmother or mother, and I said, you know, at some point she's going to have to leave, and that's going to be a terrific picture. So I stood there and I waited 20 minutes while they wandered around the church and walked out. It never occurred to me that she would walk up by herself, that she would put her hand on the door, and that she would look up. But she did that all, I guess, just for me, because I pushed the button and got the picture. That's what it takes sometimes, but one of my all-time favorites for sure. Light, composition, subject in that order. That's an interesting challenge. So focus on the light, get the composition, and leave the subject till last. That's always sort of an interesting thing to do. Steve Dissenhoff knows the story behind this one. We were walking down a street, I think it might have been 2nd Street, something like that in San Francisco, and we saw this sort of beam of light, and I said, oh, this is marvelous. I just want to wait here because I just want to wait for a guy to come by in a bicycle. Within 1 or 2 minutes, sure enough, guy comes by in a bicycle, perfectly framed in my beam of light, and gives me quite a face. Here's one inspired by a Van Gogh shot. You may have seen the shot of his niece, I think it is, standing in a shaft of light and shadow. Mine's not quite as fancy as his. Again, just another segment of light. Subject, not important. Light's more important than subject here. Of course, we had to take on the decisive moment, and as you know, that means clicking the shutter release at just the right moment to get what you want. In this case, it's getting the man's head in the palm of the dragon's hand. Worked out pretty well. This next one is another one of my favorites. This is a shot in Cienfuegos, Cuba. And what I loved about this is here are 5 people all doing different things. The girl on the left is looking at me. The guy in the red pants is either looking at the girl at the ATM or at the older woman's cleavage. I don't know. But they're all looking at different things. So this is a lot of fun. And here are 2 women waiting for the ferry at San Francisco, just looking straight down on them. Our next challenge was simplified backgrounds. It's sort of like stages, the same concept, which is find a background, in this case a very simple background, and make your shot work in front of that background. Here's an example. Another one. This is in Reykjavik. So I see this beautiful pink wall. I said, well, I'm just going to stand here across the street and wait for somebody to come in front of my pink wall. Little did I realize I would get a cute little girl with a pink backpack that's almost the same shade of pink. I got very lucky in Reykjavik. There's no doubt about it. Another thing we try and do is expose for the highlights. And what that means is letting the shadows go black. A lot of judges we know like to have shadow detail. A lot of people say, oh, you need to bring out detail in the shadows. In street photography, we often don't do that. We expose for the sunlight, let the shadows go dark. A very common and powerful technique because you get images that are graphically very strong. Here's one where I just needed somebody with red shoes. It didn't take long to get somebody with red shoes. The curiosity gap means making a photograph where it's not at all clear what is going on. This girl looks like she's suffering horribly. Perhaps she's in some kind of fire in Southeast Asia or something like that. No, she's in a fog machine at the exploratorium. So things aren't always what they appear to be. Here's some guy working on a hole in the ceiling. I have no idea what's going on up there. Times Square, New York, once again. This is 1,000 people doing yoga in Times Square. I think it happens every year. Another challenge, incidental framing. And that's where you use some part of your environment to frame your subjects. Here's one in Herald Square, I think, New York. Here's one using 2 people in the foreground to frame the subject. This is a great way, by the way, to shoot in places where you're not particularly wanted. This shot here was taken in Hong Kong. Again, I just sort of laid back, shot from low down, and I was able to shoot people through other people so that my subjects didn't really know I was shooting. Works great in Chinatown, San Francisco, too. You can't necessarily shoot the vendors close, but if you stand behind people, you can get shots of those vendors. Negative space, I prefer to call it space. Negative space is actually something a little different, but whatever, photographers call this negative space. And this is simply, in this case, keeping your subject isolated in the frame. Here's one looking down in the Hyatt Regency Hotel with a lot of space. My next images are street composites, and there are a few different styles of them. In this case, this is a shot of Havana where I took 3 separate images in panoramic and stitched them together. But you'll notice that when I did that, there are some duplicated people. So for example, if you look to the left, you'll see a guy in a green shirt and a girl in a blue shirt. And then a few steps in front of them, there's a guy in a yellow shirt and a woman in a blue shirt. Well, those are the same people. I simply changed the color of his shirt. Here's a picture in Chinatown, just shooting across the street, 3 exposures. Capture the guy 1, 2, 3 in each of the 3 panels. Here's a guy, 4 separate shots looking at an art exhibit of Andy Warhol work. This one is about 12 shots. These people, again, they were not in the same place at the same time. This is a lot of Photoshop work to mask these people into the shot to make it look like they're there at the same time. Same for this one. These people were not all there. This is probably 8 or 9 shots all put together. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that people's legs are intertwined in ways that are actually impossible. Same thing here. People walking by. None of these people were there at the same time. They were all there at different times. The camera didn't move. I didn't have a tripod. It was handheld, but it worked really well. This one from Hong Kong, again, just sort of looks like a multiple exposure, which I guess it is technically. And here's another one from San Francisco, again, probably 7 or 8 different shots. I mean, notice the way the paper is over the bicycle wheel. Well, in reality, that paper was lying on the ground. but I photoshopped it in to make it look like one complete photograph. Some of you will remember that the club had a presentation by Roxanne Overton of what we call the Roxanne Overton technique, and I applied some of those techniques to street photography. Here are a couple examples of that. A Roxanne Overton style selfie. Here's my very first Roxanne Overton technique street photograph of a sculpture on Mission Street. This one I thought worked pretty well. It's one of the BART stations on Market Street. But I've done almost no street shooting since the beginning of the pandemic. I don't think I've been out more than once since February of 2020. Instead, I've always wanted to learn platinum and palladium printing, and I thought it was very complicated. But in March, I think it was, I communicated with Dana Christensen, and she was doing platinum and palladium printing, and explained to me that no, it's not that complicated. You don't need a darkroom. Yes, there are chemicals involved, but they're not too bad, and it's a lot of fun. So I started doing a lot of platinum and palladium printing to keep me busy during the pandemic, during the lockdown. But I quickly ran out of my own images that I wanted to print. And by the way, I was saying, well, what do I do once I print them? I have nowhere left to hang up pictures in my own home. I'm not doing any gallery shows. So what I did was I reached out to a number of the Marin Photo Club's photographers and some other friends all around the world, including Austria, Athens, Greece, a couple of other places. And I found some great images that I've been printing for other photographers. So here's a look at some of the things I've been doing in alternative processing. Of course, these are iPhone shots of platinum prints, so you really don't get the effect of what the platinum print looks like. Here's a self-portrait by Alan Schuster, one of the first ones I did. I think it's a particularly great photograph, and it worked really well in platinum. Another one of my early platinum prints by Steve Dissenhoff, a beautiful woman from Kenya, I believe. This is great. This is Bill Summit and his sister. Their father had this Graflex camera for Christmas, and I just thought the picture was marvelous, and I was able to make the print for Bill. Here's a friend of mine in Austria. He was shooting stills for a movie, and this is one of the promo stills for the movie. I had a lot of fun bringing out the details in the pearls. Chris Michael did this. He's got some marvelous pictures with great light and shadow, and this is one of his favorites I did. Here's our own Larry McCloskey. I've done 3 prints for Larry, and I think Larry's planning to enter them into the alternative processing show at the Image Flow. This one is particularly nice. Here's one by our own Jeff Blum, a great portrait. Love this one. What marvelous eyes. Another by Alan Schuster. I'm hoping I can convince Alan to enter that show too. I keep working on it. And another one from Larry McCloskey. This one came out particularly well. I love the fact that I was able to get it so sharp and manage the tonality this well. So I have gone back and done some of my own images. I'm working with a new technique called platinum palladium overpigment. The idea is that you take the full image, convert it to CMYK, you then remove the K channel, the black channel, so you only have the CMY channels. You print that on paper like you normally would. Then you make what's called a digital negative from the K channel, and then you coat the paper with the platinum palladium emulsion. You paint it right over the color. Then you make your negative from the K channel, and you expose the platinum and palladium through that K channel negative. And then when you develop it, you have the platinum black over the color. And it's a pretty impressive effect. It doesn't work on all images, but I think the ones I'm showing you here work pretty well. This is my shot from Bubba's Diner, long since gone now, I guess, with, again, selective color, but that worked really well in this case. Here's my little girl in the French church, which I normally show in black and white, but I decided to do a color version using the platinum and palladium overpigment technique. And here's one of my favorite runway shots of Marissa Cole modeling on the runway, and that worked really well in platinum and palladium overpigment as well. That's it. That's all I have. We'll take some questions, and if you want to learn more, you can go to the link here for more about street challenges. or a great video that I usually show with this presentation, that's sort of the history of street photography at this YouTube link. And if you want to know more about me, here's my email address, my portfolio website, and I'm on Facebook, on Instagram once in a while, and of course those reviews that Gordon Lang and I do at cameralabs.com. Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. I want to...
Great job.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Again, I hope it was okay to show that as a video. If I had done it live, it would have been very disjointed and confusing. I got a chance to sort of get my thoughts together and edit it as a proper video.
It was very good, Doug. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And that was a great idea to put it all together like that, because, you know, it flowed very well. So you want to open it up for some questions here, Doug?
Yeah. Any questions? I got one here in chat from Cindy. She asks, do you prefer color or monochrome for street photography, and why? Generally monochrome. Why? That's a good question. I think I like, well, first of all, I shoot a lot of film, and because I develop my own film and I don't do color, I have to shoot black and white. So that's sort of a default answer. But I like the process of interpreting things as black and white. I do color when color's the best way to show a picture, but I would say 3/4 of my images are done in black and white. Michael Brunsfeld. Oh, Doug, I already knew you're a mess. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Scott. Okay. Any other questions?
Doug, I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you walk up to some of these people that you're photographing that they don't necessarily, I guess they don't really know it, but then they realize that you're taking their pictures. Have you ever had someone get really mad at you and say, hey, you got to delete that picture or anything like that? Or how do you manage that?
Oh, yeah. You get used to that. And this is the question that I get every time I give a street photography presentation. It's the most basic question. Yeah, I mean, you have to be prepared to be told no. I've never had anybody physically harm me. I've had some people get very angry, but I've never been injured. But you get used to the rejection. It's part of it. But I think the real issue is when you get better at it, you don't get rejections. And how is that? Well, if you're going to take a picture of somebody, you need to know why. If you're going to embarrass them, you shouldn't take the picture anyway. If you see something about them that's appealing, something you like, I mean, shooting beautiful women on the street, that's a no-brainer. But if you find somebody interesting and you think they're interesting, and if you can verbalize that, one of the things I'll often do is take a picture from a distance, approach them, introduce myself, start a conversation, get to know them. Show them the picture that you took on the back. Tell them why you think they are an interesting subject. What is it about them that makes you want to take the picture? If you can convey that, then usually they'll let you shoot. My biggest problem isn't approaching people. My problem is when I do that, I feel like I'm imposing, and I don't spend enough time to get the best shot I could. I'll take a couple of pictures and maybe I'll ask them to move or turn a little bit. But what I'm trying to get better and better at is to once you get the permission, then make a really good photograph of the person. So I hope that answers your question, Marcelino.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Thank you. Yeah.
I think that I can answer that going out with Doug several times. Doug has a great gift of gab. He usually walks up to somebody and starts a conversation before he even begins to take a picture. And I mean, he has that personality that he just brings that out in people.
Thank you, Russ. You make me feel so good.
One other quick thing with regards to that, Doug, do you ever need model releases from some of these subjects? You know, I guess if you're going to publish a book or something with them, I think you would probably need it, right?
I've never gotten a model release in street photography, and I've put out many books. You need a model release if you're going to use a photograph for commercial purposes, and that means to advertise, endorse a product or a service. If you're going to have a gallery show, if you're going to give them to the photo club, even if you're going to do a book, you do not need a model release. Now, I'm not a lawyer. You can all talk to your own lawyers, but having done this for many years and also working in television news and filmmaking, I've got a pretty good idea what's involved with releases. I've never asked for a release.
Okay, thank you.
Michael Blunsfeld had a question. He was waving at me. Did you have a question, Michael? No, he says no. He's just waving. Let's see. Cindy asked, can you further explain the techniques discussed in the last couple of sections of your presentation a bit more? I'll just do it one more time, Cindy. What you do is, the idea is you're putting color without black onto the paper using an inkjet printer like you always do. So you get this piece of paper with just sort of this weird color look to it because a whole bunch of details are missing. And then you do the normal platinum process, which is you coat the paper right over that. You put your emulsion on there, your platinum, your palladium emulsion. And as you would do for a normal print, you take a negative, a contact printing negative. So in my case, it's an 8x10 negative, let's say, that I've made. But that negative was made only from the K channel. So it only has the black information. So you expose that. So now you have the black information from the platinum and palladium, the color image from the inkjet underneath it. You develop it. The unused platinum, palladium, and iron just disappear. So now you have the black over the color. I hope that answers your question, Cindy.
So,
and in fact, Dana and I are going to be doing a presentation for the Marin Photo Club in January for one of the education nights. We won't be going into too much detail, but that's one of the techniques we'll be discussing.
So how do you make the negative? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, the negatives, you're basically using your inkjet printer to print on that, they call it DTP, direct deposited. It's the overhead projection film, like the kind of stuff.
Yeah, like the clear Mylar type thing. Okay.
And this stuff has, it has on one side of it a kind of emulsion that will hold ink.
Okay, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have a few minutes. So, by the way, we will be putting this on our YouTube channel. So if you go to ggcs.org, there will be a link there. And for those of you that go ahead and watch it again to go over the great presentation, make sure that you subscribe and you, if you like it, which sounds like, you should, click on that, thumbs up button. And we should have this up there within a few days, I hope.
I have a question, Marcelino.
Yeah.
For Doug, how often, I assume that for a good photo, you may take a lot of ones which are trial ones or mistakes, but are you able to actually see the good photo through the lens, or is it only after the fact that you see that it's good?
Oh, no, you can usually see what you're doing. I mean, hopefully, hopefully, like, for example, the little girl in the church in France, I only had one chance to get that shot and I knew right away that I had it. But of course, I'd been standing there 20 minutes to make sure I had the right exposure and the right focus. So that was pretty straightforward. But I do shoot a lot of film. And in film, of course, I have no idea what I've got. But, you develop the confidence. So I would say sometimes I get surprised, like everybody, you get home and there's something in the frame that you didn't realize was there. That's the kind of surprises you get. The surprises you don't want are to find that something's over or underexposed or out of focus, but generally, you know what you get.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Any questions? Any comments? Nothing. Okay. Well, Doug, thank you very, very much. Glad we got you back. And wait, we have somebody waving. I see a hand. Bill.
No, that's Bill. That's a tail.
That's my cat.
Oh, it's a
I think
small
you're-
picture, so I thought it was your hand.
I think
Again, so yeah, thank you very much, Doug. And you know, we always look forward to having you on our meetings, and it's been great. I'm glad we got quite a few people from the photo club to join us as well. So thank you very much, and everyone have a happy Thanksgiving and stay safe.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Doug. I appreciate